there are people in this room and in this community who sincerely care about you, and they want you to achieve. And principal among them today, of course, is Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad. He is the president director of the Schomburg Library, 135th and Lenox. He's a graduate of Penn, University of Pennsylvania, where he majored in economics. Subsequently, he went on to get a PhD in history from Rutgers University. He's the great-grandson of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, from the south side of Chicago, from Chi-Town. I was talking to Ms. Data about that earlier. But the reason why, and I'm humbled again, the reason why we've asked him here, because we want you to know again that you can be anything that you want to be. And we're hoping that this brother will be one of the voices which will inspire and encourage you. Having said that, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad to the Village of Guam.
I want to thank Mr. McIntosh for making my visit here possible. I'm going to stand up so I can see all of you. And I want to thank all the teachers and administrators, the parents and alumni of this institution and many institutions for coming out today. It's a real treat for me. I used to be like you, right? Sitting in assembly, you know, on one hand, happy to be out of class, whatever it was that I was missing. On another hand, you know, bored and wondering, you know, what's this guy going to say, or my mind drifting elsewhere. One of those assemblies, actually, I remember, although it didn't lead to any particular musical talent on my part. I was a freshman in high school, 13 years old, I guess, when I went to high school. I was a year behind others, and R. Kelly was giving a musical performance. He went to my high school. He had just graduated.
Went to Kenwood?
I went to Kenwood, yes, the summer before. Okay, and Shaka Khan went to Kenwood. And the Brat. Anybody remember the Brat? Yes. So it wasn't a performing arts school, but it was a school that produced a lot of musical talent. But I say that to say that I was no different than you were in that moment. And R. Kelly was not who he would become. That's one of the reasons why he was performing in his high school alumni. Public Announcement had not released his first album yet, and you know, he wasn't getting into trouble with underage girls at that point, or at least we didn't know about it. But the point is that you never know who you're going to be in the company of. It's hard to appreciate when you're a teenager, but I'll never forget that moment. Why? Because it became later on. You know, kudos to my high school for taking me to make sure that I was exposed to someone who, by any stretch of the imagination, is extremely talented musically. So I feel very humbled to have had this opportunity to come here to speak to you a little bit about myself and what I stand for. That being said, one of the things that is incredibly important to me is to relate to you on a level that respects where you are in your lives, where you are in your journey. So I want to start out with a little bit of information. I want to share with you something that is advice that people from Harvard University gave to young people just about a year ago in a book called The End of Anger. How many have ever heard of Prep for Prep? A few of them. And all of you have heard of Harvard University, I assume, right? So Harvard University alumni, black alumni, and Prep for Prep alumni were interviewed by a writer, a man named Ellis Coase, about their experiences with success. And essentially, he wanted to understand the relationship between these successful people, people like you one day who grow up and have wonderful careers and families and do amazing things. He wanted to understand, what did successful black people think about the state of race relations in our country? What do I mean by race relations? Well, I mean the relationship between black people and brown people living in communities where there are not as many opportunities to do all the things that some of your counterparts who happen to be white, either on the east side of Manhattan or in the suburbs of Westchester, so on and so forth. So what is the relationship between black and brown people as successful people and their attitudes about poverty, about housing, about recreational opportunities, being able to, play in beautiful gymnasiums, so on and so forth. So that's what race relations, or even the criminal justice system, right? The fact that certain kids in this community are subject to a form of policing known as stop and frisk that doesn't happen in other neighborhoods, because the presumption is the kids in those neighborhoods are not criminals and are not up to bad behavior. Just as a kind of straw poll, how many of you have had an experience where you've been what you would perceive to be mistreated by the police? Raise your hand. How many of you know someone who says they've been mistreated by the police? Raise your hand, including those who earlier, right? So this is, for most of you, something that you're aware of, but thankfully, I'm actually happy that there are not as many hands up as I thought might be raised. So back to this analysis. These Harvard and Prep for Prep young people were asked, what did they think about race relations? And so they left behind some advice. They left behind some advice to you. They left behind top 10 statements that they thought would be useful to people just like you in navigating the future. So I want to share a few of those with you. All right? Do I have your attention? You ready? So I'm going to excerpt 4 of them, and they're really brief. And you've heard these before because all of you have wonderful teachers. Number 1, you can only go so far as your networks will take you. Well, what does that mean? That means, if you know talented, ambitious, hardworking people, if you surround yourself in a culture of success, around people who want to do things with their lives, then you are more likely to succeed. That's number 1. So have a good network. Number 4, and I'm skipping because I don't want to go through all 10, but you can borrow from this library, or you can come to Schomburg and read, or you can go to any New York Public Library branch and pick up, it's called End of Anger, The End of Anger. All right. Number 4, embrace self-discipline and perseverance as virtues. Self-discipline and perseverance as virtues. Well, it essentially says, try again if at first you don't succeed, right? You've heard this before. So be committed, be passionate, care about what it is that you're focused on. Absolutely take that advice, right? That's good advice for success. Number 7, cultivate people who are more powerful and important than yourself. Cultivate people who are more powerful and important than yourself. Well, that sounds a lot like what we're all here for, right? I have a pretty good job. I get to run my mouth in all sorts of places, sometimes on the radio, on television, at schools, at universities. I make a little bit more money than you with your part-time job. So I'm a little bit, in the grand scheme of things, a little more, quote, powerful than you. So this is a cultivation opportunity. You get to know me, I get to know you. Maybe one day I get to help you out. So you're cultivating people more powerful than yourself. That's rule number 7. Well, rule number 10 is never talk about race or gender if you can avoid it, other than to declare that race or gender does not matter. Now, I have explained all the other ones on my own. And I think all of the other ones you've heard before to one degree or another. But what are we to make of rule number 10? What exactly does that mean to you? Well, without putting you on the spot, and without forcing you to answer an uncomfortable question, let me tell you what your peers have said to a statement like that. So there's this research institute out in the world. It's called the Pew Research Center. And Pew is the name of rich people who left lots of money to make sure that information would be collected to tell us about the world we live in. So that's what you get, all you need to know about Pew right now, P-E-W. So Pew did a research sample, and they wanted to know what black people thought about racism today. And they did this study in 2007, and essentially they asked a whole bunch of questions. What do you think about President Barack Obama? Who do you think is more influential, 50 Cent or Al Sharpton? Some of these questions are actually not so smart and reflective of other problems in our society, but that's for a different day. Nevertheless, Pew wanted to ask young people just like yourselves what they thought about racism in America, what they thought about race relations, just like those Harvard MBAs and those Prep for Prep alumni. Well, this is what they came up with. and I'll quote, "More than half of African Americans agree that the main reason that many blacks can't get ahead like their white counterparts is because of their own, responsible for their own condition, choices that they made in society. Less than a third chose discrimination as the main factor. That is to say, abusive policing, teachers who don't care about you, not at the school, but at others, because we're talking about a big sample. Opportunities to get a job, to go and to fill out an application, and whether you get a job versus someone else. And we actually can talk about that because we have evidence to suggest that there is a problem in society. But listen to this. This is the kicker. Older adults actually believed more so that racism existed in society than young adults. Young adults were more likely than older adults to choose their own fault over discrimination. Young adults, you. So if we go back to rule number 10, Harvard's MBA advice, essentially rule number 10 is saying to me as a representation of you that you have nothing to worry about in the world having anything to do with being black or brown or being a woman or a young lady. That the world will treat you equally and show you the same respect and courtesy in this society as anybody else. Now, how many of you believe that to be true? And I really, this is important to have candor and to be honest. How many of you believe it's true?
Rephrase it.
Okay.
Rephrase it.
How many people believe that your chances of success have nothing to do with the color of your skin, or whether you're a boy or a girl or a young woman or a young man or a man or a woman? Okay. So some shy hands. Well, you are entitled to believe that, and in some ways your success might in fact be predicated on that belief. Part of what Harvard, and what do I mean by predicated? I'm sorry. Predicated means that what we believe sometimes can overpower our actual circumstances. Sheer belief and optimism can sometimes carry us across the finish line. But what does it mean to live in a world where the deck is actually stacked against you? And I would argue that for most of you, including your parents and teachers, there is a stacked deck. So let me just give you a couple of examples. On average, wealth is a representation of accumulated assets over long periods of time. Okay? That's what wealth is. Wealth is not what you bring home in a paycheck, what mom and dad bring home in a paycheck. Wealth is what you have in assets: a home, artwork, cash in the bank, retirement savings. It is the culmination of all your assets minus anything you owe: credit card bills, car payments, so on and so forth, mortgage. You all understand that. Well, this is just one example. The wealth gap in America is so substantial that it has actually grown since you were in grade school. On average, the average white person in America has wealth equivalent to about $115,000. You can Google it later. Okay? The average black person has wealth equivalent to, someone just throw out one number quickly, a number. $5,000. That's exactly right. $5,000. Well, what does wealth mean in America? Well, wealth is a reflection of your ability to send a child to college. Wealth is a reflection of your ability to take care of a sick loved one if they should happen to fall ill and their health insurance is not sufficient to cover the full scale of medical benefits. We're talking about life or death resources. We're talking about the possibility of a future versus no future. So the wealth gap is itself a critical indicator of inequality. But that doesn't tell us how to reconcile how that happened. So if you believe that the wealth gap, the 110,000 on average versus 5,000 is a reflection of the poor choices that you made or your parents made, if you think it's a reflection of the fact that you went to Watley versus Dalton, well then, therefore, you're saying, well, it's my own fault. That as a young adult, the choices my parents made for me and the choices that I made are essentially a reflection of that wealth gap. Well, I would not be doing my professional duty if I did not tell you that that is absolutely and patently false. The wealth gap is a reflection of multiple generations of whites benefiting from social programs and opportunity in America that were absolutely discriminatory. I'll just give you two quick examples, and you can share them with the world. You can share them with your colleagues. You can tell your parents or your teachers. If somebody says something, you say, that's not right, because Dr. Muhammad from the Schomburg told me otherwise. And you can also Google it and look it up. All right. So in the 1940s, America had just come out of World War II. It had just defeated the Nazis and had just defeated the Japanese and was on its way to a period of tremendous prosperity in this country. Part of that prosperity was based on the fact that the war had built up the industrial capacity of the nation, because we had all of these machines and factory equipment that had built ships and airplanes, and now, well, there was no more war, so we could build automobiles and we could build prefabricated homes. Has anyone ever been driving down the interstate? I know you're all New Yorkers, but occasionally you get on the interstate and go elsewhere and seen a home on the back of a truck. It's a weird thing to see, right? But a lot more homes were built back in the 1940s that literally were prefabricated. They just built the home, put it on a flatbed, and sent it out to wherever it was going to go. So this was a moment of tremendous manufacturing opportunity in the nation. The nation was the world's leading manufacturer, like China is today. And it created tremendous opportunity. But that opportunity was not just based on our capacity to produce because of the war. It was also based on government policies. Government policies that invested in America's hardworking working classes. Two of those policies had a direct impact on the wealth gap that we see today. One of them, no surprise, had to do with education. It was called the GI Bill. It made possible an entire generation of men who had gone to fight in the greatest worldwide battle, forces of good and evil, of totalitarianism and genocide against the Jews, and people fighting to spread democracy. Now, that's a very complicated history, and you've got great teachers, and they'll clarify and give you all the nuance you need later on to explain that. But in the meantime, this GI Bill rewarded those veterans of that war by giving them essentially 4 years' worth of college tuition. It was a moment in this nation's history that my parents were the beneficiaries of. My grandparents lived through that period as well. So this is not ancient history, okay? This is very real history. There are people in this room who likely benefited from the GI Bill to one degree or another. That's right. So what did that mean? Well, it meant essentially for the first time in the nation's history, college became accessible to an entire generation of Americans that had never been, college had always been an elite bastion. It had not been available to them. And it provided the intellectual opportunity that people needed to compete in corporate America, in technical jobs, to have professional jobs that were not just about putting bolts in a piece of metal that would become a car, even though those jobs were good too then. So what does this all have to do with relation to the wealth gap today? Well, it turns out that the GI Bill put in place certain provisions that contributed to making opportunities more abundant for white men and less abundant for black men. Now, what did that look like? Well, it meant that, first of all, the GI Bill was discriminatory on the basis that it rewarded those who fought in the war. Well, African Americans were not even subject to actual equal participation in the war until 3 years after the war ended in 1948 with a presidential order. So I don't want to complicate this too much, but essentially there were fewer black men able to fight in World War II than were willing to fight in World War II. So a reward based on your contribution to a war was already a deck stacked against that generation of black people. That's number one. Number two, when people went to use their educational benefits, when they went to a college and they said, let me in, I want an education, I want to improve my life, most colleges said to black people, you can't come here. You're not welcome. We don't want you here. We don't take your kind. And when black people went to black schools, historically black colleges and universities, they did the best they could, but guess what? They couldn't take all those people. They didn't have enough capacity to absorb all those people. And that was the beginning of the NAACP's fight for equal opportunity in education. Because they looked at the situation, they said, we've got too many talented young black people with these GI dollars, and they need to go to schools that will give them the best chance to make it in America. So people like James Meredith was fighting to get into Ole Miss. You ever heard of James Meredith? Well, you'll get to it in your civil rights history. So that's number one. Education was the basis for the opportunities that an entire generation of white Americans got that dollar for dollar were not equal to the opportunities that black Americans got. But does anybody know, so education is a precondition for wealth accumulation. That's what I'm telling you. But does anybody know what is the number one basis for the wealth gap today? That number that I mentioned, 115,000. What's the number one basis for it? Nobody knows? It's okay, because we're in school. We're here to learn. All right. So the number one basis is home ownership. Owning your own home. So we live in New York City. It's not easy to own a home. It's the most expensive island, particularly in Manhattan, in the world. Okay? So it wouldn't be a surprise to me if most of you didn't come from homes where a parent owns the home. And you shouldn't feel any shame in that game, because New York City is a city of renters. But in the rest of the world, right, outside of New York, home ownership is a crucial asset that most people have as the basis for what we define as wealth. How did so many people get so many homes in America? Anyone ever been to Levittown, Long Island?
Yeah.
Ever heard of Levittown? Okay. Well, Levittown was this grand experiment back in the 1940s, right at the tail end of World War II. And it was a tremendous opportunity for the federal government to address a huge housing shortage that had come about because the Great Depression meant that people could not afford to live in their homes and had lost the homes that they had. And then the war was the era of the baby boom generation. So all these babies were born just before people went off to war. Right? So if you were going off to war and you're 19 and you've got a sweetheart, you know, one, you're going to get married really quickly, and two, you're going to have a baby because you just don't know if you're going to come back. And you felt like it was important to consummate your marriage and to leave a little bit of you behind in the world. So the greatest generation of babies were born in the 1940s and early 1950s, called the baby boom generation. Well, those people actually, many of them survived the war. They came back and had nowhere to live. So the federal government pumped gazillions of dollars, in today's terms, billions of dollars, into the housing market to build homes. How did they do it? It's kind of complicated, but essentially they said to banks and real estate developers, we're going to subsidize with guarantees that if you build a whole bunch of homes and nobody buys them, we'll give you your money back. But if you build a bunch of homes and a bunch of people buy them and they cannot make their payments because they've extended themselves too much, we'll give you your money back. So they essentially made it risk-free for people to build homes and for people to buy homes. Well, it sounds like a pretty good deal, right? They also changed the terms of buying. Back in the day, right, carrying from centuries of Judeo-Christian beliefs, debt was considered a bad thing. It was sinful to have debt. So most of our banking system did not accommodate buying things on a long-term basis. It was actually in the moment of the late 1930s and 1940s that new banking terms allowed for people to buy houses on extended periods. I mean, it was unheard of to buy a house in 10 years. What's the average term of buying a house today? Anyone know? 30. See, that's what I'm saying. You all should be very proud, right? Well, 30 years was like no one could ever imagine. It was almost like having a black president. Like you just, you couldn't buy a house over 30 years. I mean, my gosh. So So what they did was they made it really cheap. No money down, pay it back in 10 years, and if you can't make a payment, well, we'll make sure that the bank gets their money back, talking about the federal government. This was a huge project. It created houses all over America for single families. Except, well, you know, you get the punchline. And it's sad that it's a punchline, but it is a punchline. Except for black folks and Mexican Americans in the Southwest, small numbers of Asian Americans, Chinese Americans in the West. These were red-lined groups of people who essentially were not welcomed in these new homes which were built overwhelmingly for white people. And if this happened in the 1940s, and if houses have become the basis of people's wealth, doesn't that tell you then that today's wealth gap is owed in significant part to the fact that you had a generation of white men who got a great start in education with college? Anyone ever seen the series Mad Men? Oh, yeah. Or know of it on television? Yeah. Well, it's a kind of a tribute to a bygone era where men ruled the roost, where men were the head of corporate Americas, and they wore black suits and white ties, and they had little pocket squares like the one I'm wearing. Mad Men is a euphemism for Madison Avenue men, people who helped to shape the marketing industry. Anyone want to be in advertising, want to be a marketer one day? No? Okay, that's all right. This is a performing arts school. I get it. So, consequently, those educational opportunities and those homes that were essentially given away were a huge redistribution. That was a bad word in the recent election. A huge redistribution of taxpayers' dollars to support basically the white working and middle classes. And those same homes that were built in the 1940s and 50s, split-level ranch houses, colonial houses, Tudor-style houses that dot the landscape of places like Yonkers, Westchester, South Orange, Montclair, you name it, Staten Island. All those homes were, many of them were built in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And the people who own those homes benefited from the ever-increasing value of real estate in those homes. And essentially, that wealth gap is owed to that today. So coming full circle, one of the most common indicators of racial inequality, the difference between black and brown people's success in America and white people's success, is the wealth gap. And a lot of people say that the wealth gap is a reflection of poor people who make poor decisions, who don't take school seriously, who don't plan for long-term success. Now, some of that's true, but guess what? That's not just black and brown people that do that. It's legions of white folks. Like, guess what? I mean, I don't want to get too provocative here, but the vast majority of impoverished people in this country are not black or brown, and they don't even live in cities. They're white rural Americans, and nobody pays them much attention. It's a shame, but they don't. Now, there's some ways in which they themselves contribute to their invisibility because they invest in certain ideas that have very little to do with their economic status. They like guns in some cases. They support a Republican Party that is absolutely committed to making sure that that wealth inequality continues. So they've got some work to do on their side of the aisle. But I'm here for you. We're here talking to you. And the bottom line is that your parents and your grandparents have for a long time had far fewer resources to make opportunities for you real in this country. Absolutely. That is a fact. No matter what someone says in a Pew study and no matter what advice a Harvard MBA gives you. So if you're in a workplace one day, if you've made it to Wall Street one day, and somebody says to you, what do you think about this black guy running for president who's got this preacher named Jeremiah Wright who's talking about America, KKK, and all the terrible things it's done to black people? What are you going to say? What are you going to say when you make it one day? Are you going to say, oh, race doesn't matter anymore? You know, women have equal opportunities. They don't make 77 cents on the dollar like all the economic data tells us. Because even if that's true, it's because, well, they like to be with their families more than they like to actually go to work. What are you going to say? That's the question you have to ask yourselves. That's the question that you have to begin to wrestle with, because one day you'll be in that position, especially as Wadley and Frederick Douglass graduates. So I want to make sure that you have an answer to that question. That you look at rule number 10 at the back of that book and you ask yourself, do I want to live in a world in the future that denies the history of how wealth got unevenly spread in this community? Do I want to live in a world that denies the truth about how some groups of people in America have had much greater opportunities and compared to others? And it's not always a black and white story, but where it is black and white. You understand what I mean by that?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I think we've got a few minutes for questions. I'll finish with one final note. The Schomburg Center, if you've not been there, is a research library dedicated to finding and discovering the truth. It works with scholars, people who have academic degrees and write books at universities. It works with artists, people who write poetry. Maya Angelou has given her papers to the Schomburg Center to make sure that we can tell the story of Maya Angelou long after she's departed from this earth and long after everyone in this room has departed from this earth. We work with politicians, with activists who want to be inspired by examples of people like Marcus Garvey or Malcolm X or Ella Baker, who lived in Lenox Terrace and who was the leading organizer for the NAACP and helped to launch the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee with Stokely Carmichael. Now, if you don't know some of these organizations, you'll learn about them one day and you'll say, I remember somebody mentioning Ella Baker. Well, she lived in Harlem and lived across from the Schomburg Center. So if you've not been to the Schomburg Center, make sure that before you graduate high school, you go to the Schomburg Center. And if nothing else, you just take a look around. And in fact, this Saturday, we've got a Black Comic Book Festival. Anybody collect black comic books? Comic books with black people as the superheroes? Imagine that. Right? Well, if you're interested, this Saturday, from 10 to 4, you can stop by the Schomburg Center, and there'll be a huge festival with black comic book artists, and you're going to get some information about that passed around. So it was a real treat to be here with you today. Come to the Schomburg Center. We have a program called Junior Scholars. Has anyone ever met a Schomburg Junior Scholar? Have a friend? All right, well, now you know, right? It's your responsibility to learn more. You can go to our website to look it up. You can apply for the program. It starts every year in October, goes through May, and it's a great opportunity to spend every single Saturday. Every Saturday. So Wadley scholars won't be able to come, but the rest of you, you can spend every Saturday, 25 weeks of the year, because that's what it takes to be successful. That's right. Yay. We want yay. All right. We've got time for a couple questions. Yes? What's the name of the book? Which one? I can't hear. End of Anger. The name of the book she asked that I said you could look up is called End of Anger. Yes?
Do you believe that the gap will change over time? Because I believe it. So I don't believe that it won't change. I believe that there will be a change. Everybody says that 2013 or 2012 it was going to end. I honestly think there's going to be a big change, and that possibly could be the change. It won't be blacks would have, the more money. It would be equal, because, it's not much segregation. Racism is there, but it's not noticeable, really. So, it's possible that we could rise again.
Okay, that's a great question. So she said, do I believe that this is the beginning of change that will close that wealth gap? Yeah. Because the world's not what it used to be in the 1960s and 70s, and therefore it'll happen. Well, here's what I believe. I believe that it will only happen if you recognize that the problem is real and that you contribute, like so many others in this room, to making that belief real. If we were in church, we could talk about sort of a kind of surrender, that God will make a way, but we're not in church, all right? And I'm not trying to impugn any religion. I'm just trying that we do have the power to say, I want to make sure that it just doesn't happen because it happens. I want to make sure that I'm part of that change, that I challenge that inequality, and that if I'm a banker one day, that's one little footnote I forgot to mention to you. There are many black folks in financial industry today. There are far fewer than you actually think there are. We're only 10% of the population. And brown folks are only 15%. So, you know, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. The world is still run largely by white folks and largely by white men, period. And it'll be a little bit longer before that changes. But nevertheless, we had made strides. Guess what? The wealth gap was actually smaller in 2007 than it is in 2013. And guess what happened? A lot of bankers, including black and Latino, but mostly white, call black folks and they say, we have got the deal of the century. We want to put you in a home and we want to make sure you have the lowest payments possible. So we're going to give you these wonderful opportunities to buy homes with very little money, but, you know, you're going to get this really low interest rate, but just this one little thing might happen, but that'll never happen. Which is to say that that interest rate might go from being a little to a whole lot. So that was called predatory lending. And it turns out that in 2008 into 2009, when the Great Recession happened, the vast majority of those who lost the most, who were the biggest victims of foreclosure, were black and brown people. So the wealth gap actually grew because guess what was their biggest investment? Their homes. So we've actually moved in the wrong direction since you were in grammar school. So I would not take any comfort that just believing or being in the world is sufficient to the challenges that we face. And I would say to anyone aspiring to either be in financial services or one day, financial services is not set up to distribute equality. That's not what banks, that's not why banks go into the business of banking. So you are going into an industry, if you end up there, that is built on a philosophy of providing a little bit of service, you know, your money is safe in the bank, but taking your money and making as much money for the bank as possible. And the bankers. That's what it's for. It is not an experiment in social equality. It is not designed for that. And if we want to make banking something than what it is, then it's up to you and you and you to make it different than what it is. One last question? I saw a hand over here before I took on that question. All right. Well, thank you very, very, very much. Oh, one. No, okay, one more question. Go ahead. All right. You're cultivating a relationship with.
What inspired you to do?
She asked me probably the question that everyone probably expected me to talk about. She asked a question. She said, what inspired me to do what I do? Now, I tend not to want to talk about me and these kinds of things. I have a little bit of an aversion to motivational speakers, and I try not to be one. So in a nutshell, I'm going to tell you a very quick story. I went to college to make a lot of money. If you look at my yearbook, my high school yearbook, and it says, what do you want to be when you grow up? It says CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Come as a surprise? Probably, right? Given all that I've talked about. Well, guess what? I grew up in the 1980s when the entire culture was experiencing the heyday of the rise of financial industries, the emergence of a class of capitalists who essentially reshaped the world to make more money for companies than for people. And so unions were disappearing, and that's a whole nother lecture. But the bottom line is, I came of age in a moment where everything was about making money, right? You ever seen the movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas? Because he's a little old for you. But in any case, that was the era I grew up in. So caught up in that and not having people like me to tell me that I could be contributing to an unjust world, I went off to college for that. But guess what? College completely transformed me. Because when I got to college, I started taking classes that were part of the general curriculum, like the history of the New South, and I started learning about lynching and chain gangs, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's horrible. Like, you know, why wasn't this in the history books when I was in high school? I started learning about economic inequality because I was an econ major. I had to learn the history of economics, and I started realizing that the whole system of capitalism was built on profit, and profit was meant to be at the expense of the other guy. I mean, that's what it is, right? So once I started putting all these pieces together, there was one more straw that tipped me in the direction that I ended up in. I woke up one day in school, picked up the student newspaper. I was a junior in college, and I happened to read a column. We're about to celebrate Martin Luther King's holiday, right? So one of my college peers, I went to the University of Pennsylvania, 10,000 students. There were 500 black folks on campus. So, you know, the average student was white. And this white student wrote a column about Martin Luther King's holiday. And so I was intrigued. It wasn't every day you picked up the paper and they were talking about black people. So read the article, and essentially the whole article was a criticism of Martin Luther King as somebody who had spent his entire life trying to take white people's money to give it to black people. And I was like, really? I mean, it blew me away because I had never encountered a criticism of someone who I considered like, you know, was like Jesus, Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, I had no reason to believe that he had, that even in what this was 1988, that he had enemies. I knew he had been killed by a crazy white man, but no one had ever taught me that Martin Luther King was a despised person accused of communism by even the president, John F. Kennedy, in the time that he was actually alive, and that when he showed up in any number of black towns in the South, black folks closed their door and pulled down the shades because, you know, he was messing up the race relations in the town because everything was cool until he came around, which is a whole nother story you'll have to learn in class. There were courageous black folks who welcomed him, but many black folks just said, you know, leave well enough alone. So that article that I read about Martin Luther King made me angry. It made me frustrated. It made me realize that I hadn't been paying attention to my own history enough. And I felt like if I feel this way, then there are other people like me who feel this way. And I wanted to be part of educating myself to know differently. And part of educating myself to know differently inspired me to want to educate others. There's one other little thing in that article. He also threw in for good measure. Now, you've heard my great-grandfather was Elijah Muhammad. Some of you don't know what that means, but you do know who Malcolm X is. And Malcolm X, who was inspired by my great-grandfather and was the leading minister of the Nation of Islam in the 1950s and early 60s. Well,
That's Malcolm.
That's right, Malcolm is with us. So I have to stop, because you guys got to get to class. But here's the final point of this. In the same article, that said that Martin Luther King wanted to take white people's money and give it to black people, like Romney said more recently. The same article, the same columnist, his name is Gregory Pavlik, if you want to look him up too. Gregory Pavlik said that Malcolm X was a hate monger and an ex-pimp. And so, I mean, these are like fighting words, right? Now, there is some truth that Malcolm X had been a hustler back in the day, but that was not the point. The point was that the columnist was attacking people who I took to be sacred and took to be part of the heroes and sheroes that had helped make America a better place than it had been. So that is why I decided to go to graduate school and to study U.S. history so I could know for myself. And that journey led me to the journey I am on today, which is why I'm here talking to you, so that you might be inspired to know your own history, so that you won't take the crap that people push at you that are lies and mythologies, and like the rule number 10, give you bad advice about how to live in a world that is a fairer, more just place. Thank you.